everyone, and welcome to Inside the Rookery Season 5, Episode 11. And welcome to the stream, Stark. I'm going to pull you right up into the top corner because you are the special guest today. Thank you. We had Stark on about a month ago now, was it, at Chimera? And we invited you back because we had so much fun, and hopefully so did you, and we'll have fun again.
Oh yeah, it was excellent, and it was a lovely thing to do on a really hot, sunny evening.
It was hot and sunny.
But, yes, it was great. Very much enjoyed that.
Excellent. And I am, of course, joined by my fellow panelist, James Wallace, co-host of RPG podcast Ludo Narrative Dissidents. Hi, James. And fellow Rookery Publications writer, Andy Rees. That was a very deep hello.
Hello.
Yes, it's been one of those days.
Has it?
There's tonsillitis in the house, let's put it that way.
Good luck. If you need to take a pause to have, a drink of water or a strepsil, please do so.
Yes. I should be fine. If you see flecks of blood on my lips, don't worry. It's just complete.
Is this you getting so into the spirit of Westerns that you've given yourself tuberculosis? Is that I'll be your huckleberry.
That as well. Tonsillitis, tuberculosis. What's the difference between friends?
Yeah. Right. Well, as always, we've had a number of questions pre-submitted by patrons and by the Discord community, so we will get into them. But Stark, do you want to do a little introduction? I know you introduced yourself before, but for new viewers, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Stark Holborn. I'm a novelist and games writer and sort of film reviewer, but I don't do so much of that anymore. I've run out of time. But as an author, my first novel was called Nunslinger, and it was a Western published in 12 installments of novellas set in 1865, and it is what it sounds like. It is about a nun on the run in the West, but it isn't quite as stupid as it sounds either. So, there's that. But then I'm also the author of a series called Trigonometry, which you might be sensing like a pun title thing here going on, which unfortunately, if I said I came up with I didn't come up with the titles first and then the book second, that would be a total lie, because that's exactly what happened. Trigonometry is a series about gunslinging mathematicians from across history. So we've got Pierre de Fermat and Emmy Noether, but they're all outlaws basically in a world where maths has been banned. I'm also the author of Tenlo and Hell's 8, which are space westerns, and they're out from Titan at the moment. And then as a games writer, I'm lead writer on a game called Shadows of Doubt, which is immersive detective simulator set in a sort of neo-noir cyberpunk world. And then I seem to have made voxel-based cyberpunk dystopian noir games my very specific niche, because I'm also working on a game called Novelist, which is a follow-up to Cloudpunk, which came out in 2020. So that's what I'm doing and have been doing.
Brilliant. Well, welcome. We look forward to chatting with you more. So we've got, as I said, we've got some questions pre-submitted, and they start quite basic, although it also sounds a little bit like a therapy session. So everyone can chip in on this one. So Ty asks, what was your first memory of Westerns? And what draws you to them?
What draws you? Tell me about your mother.
Yeah, tell me about your childhood.
I had a really weird childhood, but Westerns, I didn't like them growing up. I had no idea what they were. No one really watched them that I knew of. I don't know. I just didn't have any exposure to them. And so if you told me when I was sort of a teenager that I'd end up writing Westerns, what's wrong with you? No, I'm not. But I think so. My first proper exposure came a lot later, and it was probably Jim Jarmusch's Dead Man. 1995 film with Johnny Depp and Gary Farmer, and it really is like a weird acid western, so it's kind of quite surreal and dark and psychedelic and quite funny in places. So I saw that and I loved it. And then the second thing was a book called The Sisters Brothers by Patrick DeWitt, which has been made into a film now, and I read the book and was just, I don't know, I loved it so much. I loved the strange humor and the darkness of tone and setting, and so I was just really fascinated by both of those. And then one night we got back very late from the pub and put the TV on, and there was a movie on, a Western. And it wasn't Two Mules for Sister Sarah, which is the classic non-Western. It was a different one called Madron, I think. But someone made a joke and said, "Oh, haha, nunslinger, gunslinger." And so I went, "Gunslinger." I wonder if I could write that. And then wrote a novella, and then just by sheer luck, publisher liked it and asked for 12 more.
Wow.
So yeah,
how was this actually? Sorry to jump in. How was this published as novellas? Was it online? Were they physical novellas? Was this like Dickens doing his stuff in monthly installments?
Oh, that would have been amazing. Imagine that in like a kind of old, like grubby newspaper would have been brilliant. But no, they were published as digital, like a digital serial. And it was Hardo who published it, and they were like, "Oh, we've never done this before. It's going to be a digital online serial. It's going to be great." And then they were like, "We've never done this before because no one buys them." But they did publish it it was really fun. It was my debut novel, as it were. So, but I was writing them as we were publishing them. So I had to do 3 every 3 months, and we were editing them and copy editing and proofing and releasing all within that 3-month window. So it was like a crash course in how to edit a novel, but like 12 times. And then at the end they brought out the big omnibus edition, which is chunky book. So yeah, that's how it worked. It was all a bit mad, but I'm glad we did it.
And when you say novella, how many thousand words is that?
I think they're between, see now I can't remember. I think that they're between, I think the shortest one's about 12 and the longest one's about 18, I think.
Right.
1,000 words. Yeah.
So chunky.
And what about you two? Do you love Westerns? What's your Western chat?
I mean, I don't think I can remember a time where I wasn't aware of them. There's a really cute / embarrassing photo of me up on my Facebook page that my sister found of me when I must have been like 3 or 4. Me and my best mate Pers, and we're both sitting there, and we've got like little holsters on, and like nowadays you probably wouldn't give toddlers toy guns, I guess.
Yeah.
But it was a different time. It was the late 70s. Who cared? But yeah, and I think like, although what is interesting, I think stuff like Bonanza and stuff on TV when I was a kid, I was only vaguely aware of that. But I got really into the Clint Eastwood Westerns at far too young an age, particularly because the first one I watched was High Plains Drifter.
Oh, wow, yeah.
A particularly odd one where he like paints himself red like the devil at the end and stuff. Like, yeah, like that. And I watched that, like, I mean, I think I was still single digits when I saw that. And but I loved it because I obviously shouldn't have been watching it. And yeah. So yeah, I don't know. It's a genre that I'm not obsessive about, but I always enjoy when it's on. And the Sisters Brothers was a novel that blew me away. Like I love the little narrative games that he plays, and also like, I mean, so one of the most interesting novels I think I've ever read is Blood Meridian, Cormac McCarthy's one. I would not go so far as to say that I enjoyed it.
It's not really about enjoying it.
No,
so much
like it was a harrowing experience, but I really felt like I'd lived through it. Like it was visceral, much like The Road. Like I felt like I'd lived through this terrible experience. So yeah, so I guess I appreciate it. I guess that, and we'll get onto this later when we talk about games, but it allows for a lot of different freedom because there's lots of different stories that you can tell within that sphere. You can tell your, kind of really positive. You can tell your heroic last stand. You can tell your grueling, kind of psychological torture. So yeah. What about James?
What about you, James?
I grew up in this. I'm a little bit older than most of you, I think. So at a time I was growing up, if you were flipping through the TV channels, typically on a Saturday afternoon or something, there'd be a Western. This is back in the days when there were 3 TV channels in the UK.
Wow.
I am that old. But one of them would be showing a Western, and it wouldn't be one of the good Westerns. It would be kind of mid-range, in color at least. But also the children's programming during the school holidays would include one of the serials from I'm guessing the 1950s, which were shot in black and white. Champion the Wonder Horse, but there were also cowboy serials as well. And these were like 15 minutes of an ongoing story. So I became aware of the tropes and the genre conventions through watching mediocre, probably written in a hurry, made in a hurry westerns. And it was only later that I came to the Sergio Leone, the later Clint Eastwood stuff, and then the renaissance of the western, which I think comes after Blazing Saddles had pretty much comprehensively destroyed the old western and made it quite clear you couldn't do that anymore because people would laugh at it. So one of the things that I do wonder about is, do we now have a generation of people who, you know, perhaps have watched Deadwood and have watched the Sisters Brothers and what's the Sam Raimi western that I can't remember the name of? Gene Hackman and what's her name? No, Sam Raimi. It's
yeah.
It's got lots of his camera tricks. It's one of his first big Hollywood movies.
The Quick and the Dead.
Quick and the Dead, yes.
Yeah.
So they've watched that, but I think a lot of them, because it comes around on telly quite a lot, will be familiar with Western tropes from Blazing Saddles, which is in many ways, a very accurate satire.
Do you think, I'm really sorry to tell you this, James, but I think most people younger than us won't even have seen Blazing Saddles because I haven't seen it. So...
You've never seen Blazing Saddles?
No, but here's the thing, right?
God.
Here's the thing you have to understand is that I grew up without a television in my house. So I'm not sure, just full disclosure, I've ever watched an actual Western that you would think of as a classic Western all the way through. Like sometimes we would have a television for a short period of time and like I would watch stuff with my dad and he had grown up in that era when Westerns were pretty cool and you would go to the cinema to watch a Western. And he would always tell me stuff like, do you know this guy? Like he was a short guy, like he stood on a box in this scene. But I don't think I've ever watched a Western from end to end, unless we count Blaze of Glory, you know, the John Bon Jovi song that goes along with that film as a Western. Do we count that as a Western?
So you haven't actually watched Young Guns 2? You've only watched the music video from Young
I've
Guns
watched
2.
Young Guns. I've watched Young Guns and Young Guns 2. I've definitely watched them. Yeah. I've watched Westworld. No,
that totally counts. Yeah.
Sorry,
because again, Westworld is riffing.
Not Westworld.
The original Westworld is riffing on the tropes. It's about people going to a theme park to play at being cowboys.
We have to do this in order. I was thinking of the Will Smith film, Wild Wild West.
Wild Wild West.
Okay.
Now that film, I mean, it's a terrible film, but it has a really interesting history because it got passed around and around and around and around through different people, and everyone said, no, this is shocking. And then eventually, I can't remember who directed it in the end, but it was basically someone who like drew the short straw, and there was this like, someone was saying, it has to have this massive mechanical spider in it.
There's a legendary producer who just wants giant spiders
as the spider
in all his movies. And he is awful. He's legendarily bad. And somehow keeps his job.
And then I did watch the first series of Westworld, but I had to have some of it explained to me because I hadn't watched the original Westworld.
Oh yeah, okay.
Various things. So that was a challenge. But so me and Westerns, I also, when I was quite young, I thought that Westerns were made like in the time period in which they happened.
Oh bless.
So
because you thought that with Happy Days too, didn't you?
I thought that was Happy Days. I thought that was with Grease. I thought that I don't know the history of film was much longer and TV was much longer than it was anyway. So Westerns.
Did you not watch Tombstone, Lindsay? I thought I had a memory of you and Andy watching Tombstone together, but maybe I'm misremembering.
So I think that I am so sort of freaked out by Westerns that I've maybe like mentally blanked many of the Westerns that you, me, and the other Andy have either watched together or Andy and I have watched. If he was here, he'd be like, no, you've watched this, you've watched that. And I'd be like, no, I don't remember watching that all the way through. So yeah, Westerns, I just find them like, you know how 80s and 70s and 80s interior decor is kind of freaky. You know, like it's kind of freaky. That's how I feel about Westerns.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting going back to like what do people think of when we think about Westerns now, because I mean, the westerns I've been interested in, because I started watching more of them when I was reviewing them actually for a website, and I don't like John Wayne westerns. I think they're shit. Like I hate John Wayne. He's an asshole. Like, so the westerns I was interested in were revisionist westerns for a start. So they were, you know, very much revising the idea of manifest destiny and you know, bringing civilization and the good white hats winning and everything. And so I kind of watched a lot of those from the 70s. But there's a reviewer I follow, she's called Maria Lewis. She's a journalist and a writer. She's excellent. And she said a thing about, there was a series on recently called The English, which had Jessica Spencer and Emily Blunt, and it was really good. It was exactly what I want from my westerns. Like completely dismantling the idea of what a traditional western is, presenting it from multiple viewpoints. And Maria Lewis basically said, like, most revisionist westerns aren't actually revising very much. Like, they may be revising one of the standpoints, but there's so many other viewpoints to see the genre from, and so many other voices we need to hear from in the genre. So yeah, I think a lot of people hopefully are coming at it from completely challenging anything that's gone before, and like not sticking to any of the tropes, and or if they are, then just upending them from the start. Anyway, that's what I'm interested in seeing. But yeah.
Or alternatively, utterly reinventing them. I was just reminded of Tears of the Black Tiger, a Thai Western, if anyone's ever seen that. Wow. It is a Western made in Thailand, riffing on the genre tropes of Thai action movies and Westerns. And it is extraordinary, and I recommend it very highly.
Oh, I'm going to write that down.
It is completely bonkers.
What did you say it was? Tears of the
Black Tiger.
Nice.
There's another great one, which is an Indonesian Western by a director called Muli Surya, and she made it because she was like, I hate how male dominated this genre is, so I'm gonna make my own. And it's great. It's called Marlena, a Murderer in 4 acts, and it's pretty dark. It's quite bleak, so you know you've kind of got to be able to kind of go there. But it's kind of Tarantino-esque, and it's she's sort of taking a few of the tropes and then just completely doing away with a lot of the other kind of more damaging stereotypes in them. But so I know what you mean when it's like, because I think everyone want to say, oh, you know, I'm really interested in Western. I'm gonna love, like, I don't know, Rio Bravo and stuff, and I have very strong opinions about Rio Bravo, which aren't probably popular. But
I'm very aware we're talking about Westerns as if they were an entirely cinematic genre, and of course they're not. There was an entire genre of pulp Western novels and magazines, in the same way that perhaps being games fans, we think about the horror pulps, we think about the science fiction pulps, but there were Western pulps as well. There were long-running series of novels. It was and many comic books as well. Early comics, there were the comics heroes. And Jonah Hex has persisted to the present day, including a very bad movie that we won't talk about. But the comics character has lasted and lasted. So, and obviously you're coming at this as from a written point of view. Are you riffing on the tropes of cinematic Westerns, or the written Western, or going for the bigger kind of, you know, the bigger picture of what is the platonic ideal of a Western, and with the different shadows on the wall of the cave out in Death Valley?
I think I do refer to, like, cinematically, have a lot of cinematic touchstones, and with my sci-fi as well. It's like, you know, with Tenlo and Hell's 8, they're my big influences are stuff like, you know, Mad Max, but also you know, the Alien films and The Thing and John Carpenter. So, but I think that goes back into what my interest is in terms of written Westerns, which is like the pulp genre. And I am quite fascinated with pulp as a kind of concept in that. And I think it's what Philip K. Dick did quite a lot. You read some of the beginning and he's putting all these like stupid pulpy things in, but he's doing something really serious, but in a quite pulpy way. And I'm sort of quite a fan of doing that, because I quite like writing these like headlong, action-filled, quite pulpy books. But I'm also doing hopefully some serious stuff. But like,
like John Carter of Mars could have been like if John Carter had gone west instead of going into space, he could have been a Western, but instead he
Yeah.
became like
Yeah.
a space.
Yeah.
Shall we talk
And
about
just-
sci-fi? Because sorry,
Yeah.
Andy, on you go.
Well, just very briefly, just actually to build on what James said, like the other kind of genre that maybe particularly younger people might have come to Westerns is obviously video games, with both
Yeah.
Red Dead Redemption and the sequel,
Mhm.
both being these massive.
And
I mean, people
Fallout
are-
as well.
yeah, and like people are still playing those games. Like Red Dead Redemption 2 came out, like what was it, like 7-8 years ago, and people are still playing it online. And there's rumors that there might be a remaster coming. So, yeah. But not that it necessarily does anything particularly clever with the genre, but it exposes them to it.
They probably need to hire just a few more people with some, to really the writing stuff. But yeah.
Yeah, I think John Carter was a Confederate soldier.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
Warren-
sorry, I meant John Carter,
Yeah.
not John Carpenter.
Yeah.
I was like
John Carpenter of Mars.
Yeah.
Oh, wait,
Carpenter, but-
He did one, didn't he? And it was
Yeah.
awful.
Yeah.
I can't even remember
Oh,
what
he
it's
did.
called now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I haven't seen it, but I love
It-
John Carpenter so
it
much.
goes
So I'm
Do
willing.
not watch
Mars.
his film about Mars.
Oh.
It's dreadful.
Was it Ghosts of
I'm wi-
Mars? That one.
Ghost
Yes,
of Mars?
that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm willing to forgive him a lot. So
Yeah.
well, maybe we'll
Yeah.
see.
Yeah, that is what I was thinking. Like John Carter, if like it starts with kind of a Western and then he goes into space. And you've got like similar problematic tropes to some Westerns in his encountering the indigenous people of Mars.
Yeah, sorry.
Let's talk a bit about space or sci-fi because it's 1921. We've got through one question. It's chat. So we might
It was
get
a good
started.
question.
It was a good question.
It was. That was great.
Yeah.
Hopefully, I've purged my soul
Yeah.
to the.
And
That's
so, what
fine.
about space or sci-fi? It's such a massive genre. Where did you get started with it, and what's your favorite sci-fi subgenre? Just as a note, Gene Roddenberry describes Star Trek, the original series, as Wagon Train to the Stars. So if
Yes,
yeah,
heard that.
is Star Trek as a space western an influence on you?
I never thought of it as an influence on.
I never thought of it as a space western until literally today when I looked that up and found that on Wikipedia.
Yeah. Was it sci-fi? Going back to sci-fi, the question where did I get?
Like what about
started with that?
space or sci-fi? It's a
Yeah.
massive genre.
Oh, in terms of space and like actually being realistic with my science in my sci-fi, it's not. I'm like, woohoo! Let's wait. Who knows? The spaceship works. Doesn't matter how it works. Who knows? There's a moon. Yes, people can breathe on the moon. It's fine. I don't need to explain it. But that's because it's for me. That's not what I'm interested in about the genre. But I think science fiction I was exposed to a lot earlier. Actually, my dad read a lot of it, and he had this habit of me and my sister, instead of reading us kids' books as bedtime stories, he'd basically read us whatever he was reading at the time.
Clever.
From wherever he got to in the book, he'd just start reading that to us. And so he read, like Brian Aldiss and Herman Hesse and like William Burroughs. None of the really bad bits, but so I remember being exposed to it from quite a young age and having the books around. And then I think later it was probably reading people like Philip K. Dick and some of the sort of classic sci-fi authors that kind of got me back into it. And then a bit later, people like Nalo Hopkinson and her world building just made me like, oh, so good. I want to do this. And then cinematically as well, like lots of big favorites. But how about all of you? Was sci-fi something you grew up with? I didn't really grow up watching. I grew up watching Star Trek because it was on at that really good 6 o'clock slot when you got home from school, and you'd have like Neighbours, Simpsons, and then something else like Star Trek or Due South or like Quantum Leap or something.
Yeah, I think my first memories of movies are sci-fi, in that they are the Star Wars movies and E.T. respectively, which really dates me as a young child in the early 80s.
Literally my earliest memory is not watching, but is walking out of the cinema having watched a double bill of Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back.
I mean, that is, as far as like credentials go.
Yeah. Yeah, but I don't remember the film. I just remember walking out really excited, having seen it, but no memories of the actual thing itself. But yeah, I've always been like sci-fi's always been my thing. Like when we talked before on Rookery streams about dream projects, and like everybody else is always like, "Oh, fantasy." I'm like, but genuinely much more interested in sci-fi actually. But it just doesn't sell in the RPG industry nearly as much. Sadly.
Okay.
Yeah, but no, I've always, and similar to you, Stark. Actually, but a lot of it came from books that my mum and my dad had sort of lying around the house, and so I was reading like Isaac Asimov again when I was in like 7 or 8 years old. Did not understand it. Did not understand how problematic parts of it were either. But it was in space. Hey, that was all I cared about. So. Yeah, and I think we must be very similar ages as well, because I recognize that post-school TV timetable as well. So yeah,
yeah.
Yeah, I grew up in a time before Star Wars, if that makes sense. Star Wars came out.
What the hell?
I know. I was 11 or 12 when it came out. And before that, there was almost no science fiction on telly at the cinema, and it was hard to get science fiction books as well. And we lived in the middle of nowhere in Suffolk. And my parents did not read very much. And I didn't really encounter science fiction. I think I got hold of some of the Harry Harrison Stainless Steel Rat books before I saw Star Wars.
Oh my God.
And so I was reading science fiction before I was watching science fiction. I was vaguely aware of Doctor Who. I wasn't allowed to watch Doctor Who because it might scare my sister. My parents' excuses for things, I look back and I just go, well, it sort of made sense at the time, but what? Anyway, so yeah, once I latched onto science fiction, I was just absorbed it voraciously. But a lot of British science fiction writers, Nicholas Fisk, who's kind of passed on, people forget about him, but he was a very influential juvenile science fiction writer. And I think a couple of his things were done on telly. John Wyndham, people like that, and a couple of other, the authors have disappeared, but the books were important. It was only later on that I started discovering Heinlein and Andre Norton and people like that, and Harry, and voraciously read Harry Harrison as well. Tried to reread some of his stuff recently. That was a mistake. You can't go back. You can't. But yeah, so written science fiction was, because the pictures in your head are always going to be bigger than and better even than Industrial Light and Magic. Though seeing Star Wars wasn't so much mind expanding. It was sort of, oh my God, other people see these pictures too. They imagine space this way as well. It felt like a homecoming.
You're such a nerd.
Oh yeah. I mean, if that's not immediately obvious, yes.
Do you know? I think that just
one of us.
Yeah. Just a little sociological point there. Just on you can't watch Doctor Who because it'll scare your sister. Like a whole generation today would just be like, but like she could just go out the room, read, like play on her phone. There's a period of time in which that was absolutely an acceptable thing to say, because you would all be, well, we wouldn't because we didn't have a TV, all in the same room sitting watching TV, and so you did have to pick something that was like suitable. You couldn't be like, no, she can go out. That would be unthinkable.
Once again, this is a recurring theme, but my parents did not really care about suitable. So we would watch whatever they wanted to watch. And so my favorite film when I was a kid was, one of them was Local Hero, and one of them was the Blues Brothers. It's like
wow,
7-year-old
that's
kid.
a good portfolio there.
Yeah,
I think because we had them on VHS, and my parents liked watching them, so those were my favorite films out of the selection. But I was like a Dark Crystal kid, not a Star Wars kid, if that makes sense.
Interesting.
Didn't see Star Wars until a bit later.
So let's have a look. This one, Lazy Cat asks, can you just take any genre and mash it up with space to good effect? So I did notice we were talking about space westerns rather than sci-fi westerns, and I felt that was like when this question came up, I was like, that's an interesting point to make. Is space just another way of saying not set on Earth? And you've said, Stark, that you're not really like into the hard sci-fi descriptions of things. So what's the appeal of space then, if it's not the science of the fiction?
I don't know. For me, I think it just gives me a bit more license to do some like bizarre, imaginative stuff. Like, and yeah, I could probably do it and make it, a weird West or whatever, Western in on Earth. But I think it was just like there was just stuff I wanted to explore there in terms of setting and tone. And the thing with Ten Low is, and actually with Hell's 8, people have said, "Oh, it's cosmic horror," and I'm like, "What? What? I didn't write cosmic horror," but I mean, it has got actually quite a lot of cosmic horror elements in it, and I think Ten Low has too, even though I wasn't necessarily aware of that when I was writing them. I think that's part of what I wanted to explore about the sort of Moon's Haunted, but like, yeah, kind of. It came out, the settings started to inform the characters, and the characters started to behave in reaction to like the setting that I put them in, and then it kind of all spiraled out from there, really. Now I'm sort of stuck with this star system that has to be coherent after 2 books. So but yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, I'm not I know some people are kind of sticklers for the SF sci-fi divide thing, but I'm whatever.
My
I don't really
favorite,
care.
my favorite like space sci-fi mashup is, I think it's called Ilium. I read it when I just had Josie, and it was a dark period. Not much sleep, don't remember very much, but my friend had given me. I'm sure it's Ilium, and it's basically like space Greek gods. And it just appealed to me at the time. It was really cool. Yeah, like Odysseus in the future. It's like a really weird mashup of them time traveling, of 20 and 21st century historians, and of gods, and of space. It's just really, really bizarre.
Is that not just because Andy looks exactly like Ulysses from that cartoon?
From Ulysses 31.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
I've literally never made that.
No, you definitely have. There was a period where we all kept sharing videos of it on
Of
Andy's
Ulysses.
Facebook because he just looks exactly like Andy. So
Yeah. No, Ilium's really cool. I would recommend that.
Nice. I mean, it definitely was. It was a thing for a while, wasn't it, in movies, of taking like a movie type or a movie like genre and then just putting it in space. So like there was that terrible Guy Pearce movie. Is it Lockdown? Is that what it was called? That's basically Escape from New York, but in space.
Oh.
And he plays a character who is so obviously a pastiche of Snake Plissken, but without any of Kurt Russell's charm. And it just
Blake Mishkin.
Yeah, it was just awful. And then Die Hard in space, and we've got a concept. Let's put it in space.
And like Doctor Who does that all the time.
Yeah,
like, and I don't know, maybe I'm just really
Star Trek
grumpy.
famously.
Yeah. I think I might just be really grumpy at the moment. But like, I was just thinking of some of the stuff Doctor Who had done, like the Titanic, the floating Titanic in space, and I'm just like, oh, fuck off.
Well, wasn't one of the things with Star Trek, as someone was telling me this the other day, didn't they, whenever you see like a themed episode when they're like Victorian London, it's because they just run out of budget. And they were like, right, what costumes you got going cheap?
Yeah.
Right, we're all Victorian now.
And
The
sets they
there.
already had. Yeah. And in fact, I just saw a great, Joe Straczynski, who did like Babylon 5 and various other things. I saw a hilariously outspoken tweet from him yesterday. Just somebody said something, trying to justify the use of the holodeck in Star Trek. And he was just like, it's lazy writing. If you don't know what your show, like that tells me you don't know what you want your show to be. It's just bad. And I was like, wow, like he didn't pull any punches. But again,
well, I just watched the latest episode of Strange New Worlds, and I really like Strange New Worlds, and it was a rare miss. I was just like, boring, done before, don't care, so lazy. Like, what the fuck is this? So that's my review.
There's a really good use of like holodeck as a concept in Emily Tesch's latest book, which is called Some Desperate Glory. And that's kind of like a space. It's kind of all about this kind of fallen empire and stuff and soldiers and things. So it's kind of military sci-fi, but once all the military stuff's done, so it's like what happens afterwards. It's great, but it's really integral to the plot in a few like intriguing ways. So if you want to see it done well.
And just kind of a follow-up to this question, Andy, who is not well, this is from Andy Law, get well soon. Both science fiction and westerns deal with a frontier spirit. Is there any other genre you could bring to bear that would have a similar tone and you could add? You mentioned cosmic horror, but what else do we think you could mash up?
I I've got this one I want to write, which is which I may or may not write at some point, but is kind of sort of a Western, but it would be set in Cornwall. It's basically there will be blood, but in Cornwall, because you had all of the mining and stuff going on there, and it was so fucked up at times. And I think you had a similar sort of sense of just like rampant exploitation, these kind of like people's kind of how awful they can be just laid bare for a couple of 100 years kind of going on down there. So I think that would be a pretty interesting setting. It's the west of
like
the
like
UK.
Yeah.
Like There Will Be Blood crossed with Poldark. Like,
Basically.
I'd watch
Don't your
that.
man in
So,
Poldark
I'd sign
have
up
the
for
right
that.
hat?
Yeah.
You basically have a cowboy hat.
Oh, well, he'd been off, hadn't he? He'd been off to America and back.
Oh,
I don't know.
But
yeah,
that series of books, Clan of the Cave Bear, Jean M. Owl, is it? That's kind of the frontier spirit, in that it is Homo sapiens meeting Homo neanderthalis, and it all kind of like it's actually got quite a similar spirit and a feel to it. But I don't know. I haven't read them for many, many years. I don't know how they stand up to scrutiny, and I certainly don't know how they stand up to our current understanding of the differences between our species and other like Homo neanderthalis and all the other species, and that they weren't probably the people that we, the 60s and the 70s used to think they were, I guess.
Yeah.
So I would have to go and read it again. Thank you. Yes, that's the lady. Or the man, I don't know. Jean? Could be either. Jean? Who knows? I've always imagined her as a woman, and now I'm like, is it a French man?
Oh yeah, like Jean Gerard.
Yeah, like I've always called her like Jean M. Owl. Maybe it is Jean M. Owl. I don't even know.
Well.
Who knows?
I mean,
I've seen
thinking...
I'm sorry, go on.
No, you go.
I was just going to say there's some mashups out there. So Daniel Polanski wrote a book called The Builders, which is basically Redwall, Brian Jacks, but a Western. Quite bloody, and then Levi Tidhar, who's a writer I like, he's a friend of mine as well. He's written a book called The Escapement, which is basically like a nightmarish, surreal kind of. It's a clown. I guess you could call it a clown western. It defies explanations. That one you just have to go and look at, because I can't describe it.
Mark, that's kind of what I was thinking, Mark, and that's why the Clan of the Cave Bear came into my mind. If anything, adding modern views of Neanderthals would be an even more interesting premise for a series, because I think it would be a much more interesting premise about the frontiers of humanity. And the old view was that they came from the Fertile Crescent, and the Neanderthals just like died out, went away. They got an illness, they were like devastated, whereas actually like current thinking is maybe like the dinosaurs, they just became birds. Maybe the Neanderthals just kind of became, I don't know, Northern Europeans. Who knows? It could explain a lot. And I think that would be quite interesting as a frontier mashup.
I mean, I'm surprised how little frontier stuff there is in fantasy. An awful lot of fantasy is kind of about settled worlds. It's worlds full of weird races and stuff, but it's kind of known. Or there's a continent that's unknown, and that's colonialism. That's not the same kind of frontier spirit at all. There's not that much kind of. I mean, there's some, and there's the Stephen King Western. What's the name of the series made into?
Dark Tower.
The Guns.
Yes.
Dark Tower,
yes.
Yeah.
There's that stuff, but in terms of kind of straight fantasy, post-Tolkien fantasy, there's not really very much there.
Do you think
it
that's
kind of follows the Tolkien idea of here's a map, we already know everything on the map.
Other than weirdly, like in RPGs, because of like the sort of standard D&D like model, if kind of you're going from a settlement out into the wilds, fighting monsters, it's interesting that's where it is in fantasy rather than in the novels. But I do wonder if it is that. We've spoken a lot in previous streams about world building and the sort of processes of that. And I think so many, particularly fantasy authors, are drawn to that idea of world building. And coming up with that cogent sense of how everything connects, but you
Yeah.
then want to share that. So it's not really about,
Yeah, we've talked a lot with a lot of authors who, especially fantasy authors, who have said, like, how did you get started? Talk to us about it. And they were like, well, when I was a kid, I had this world and I had made this world and it was populated with people and geography and things. And I wanted to write in it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder if as well it's kind of coming at it from a kind of Eurocentric sort of Western viewpoint of what settling actually is, and it's, you know, if you come at it from a different way and where, you know, it's not there for us to do anything with, it's just there and that should be enough. And you know, Becky Chambers does this in, I think it's To Be Taught If Fortunate, you know, it's what right do we have to change anything about a space that exists? It might seem like a barren area, but what do we know? Like, we don't know what's there. Like, we don't know what microbial life might be going on, and what, you know, what right do we have to change anything about an area? So I think maybe that's which is inherent in some religions that, you know, isn't in maybe a lot of the history of the genre that sort of we're talking about. But again, that's a really interesting perspective to sort of take it from.
Yeah, I feel like I can't remember if it was Ilium, because I was thinking about that earlier, or if it was another set of books where essentially it's from the perspective of fourth dimensional characters, which is a total other frontier. So essentially they can see the whole of time. And so they have a unique and different relationship with life and where life is and how life colonizes things. Maybe that was just something Andy Law made up. Who knows? But it was definitely, you know, if you think about how a two-dimensional creature would see a three-dimensional creature, and you'd kind of see a slice of it going past, and that it was the similar kind of idea that these four-dimensional creatures see the full length of your life rather than just the slices that we see of each other. Quite interesting as a concept. Okay, so we talked a bit about Westworld before. So Master of Sock Puppets asks, what do you make of Westworld? Either iteration, not in space, but definitely sci-fi. Is it just deconstructing the Western genre or inhabiting it, or both? Or something else?
I mean, both. Certainly the original, both. I mean, I'm kind of amazed they got it to stretch into a series, because it's Michael Crichton. He's very good at like doing a contained thing and being like, and here's the thing, which kind of falls apart if you try to pull it too far. It's like, you know, Westworld is basically Jurassic Park, like, and was Twister one of his? I can't remember.
Not sure.
Don't
How did
know.
that? Oh, I don't know. Twister makes me laugh so much. That's the one with the storm chasers, and it was like, that's the hurricane that killed her father type thing. Oh, got me.
I muted myself. Apparently, there's a sequel coming.
To Twister.
It's called
Twist?
Twisters.
No.
Twisters.
I just read about that last week.
I do find those kind of films really, like the person against nature films, like quite offensive sometimes, because they set up this whole, I just think it's a really unhealthy way to view our planet. I don't know why I'm like so opinionated and grumpy tonight, but I really do hate them. The way they characterize those forces of nature as somehow malevolent. I find it really repulsive.
That being said, maybe that's because it's been a while since you've had to walk home across the meadows on a windy evening, because it definitely feels like nature is out to get you.
Yeah.
when that wind is blowing and you're like, and you turn a corner and it's somehow still blowing in your face, and you're like, yeah, that feels personal. That feels like that wind is out to get you.
But it's like they make plot like. It's because it's lazy writing, right? They make these like emotional dramas, and the plot is spurred forward by some bizarre idea that someone's chasing tornadoes because their parent, like, that's just bullshit. It's just a really shitty way to make drama in your movies or your films or your books or whatever.
Totally.
Yes. That way lies the Jaws sequels.
Yeah. Oh, I hate them.
They're awful. I mean, they're
They're awful,
universally
yeah.
awful. Which yours 3 this time? It's personal, I think. It's what? It's what? Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah.
But I love the original Westworld. I rewatched the original Terminator recently, and it's putting the end of the two ends side by side. It's obvious what a debt the original Terminator owes to the end of Westworld. Just the nature of this implacable robot that will not stop, and because it's pretty will not be reasoned with, it's going to kill you unless you can do it first. And I think Cameron does it better. But I remember seeing Westworld at an impressionable age after Star Wars. But it was a gosh wow movie at that point. It was this is really good because it doesn't explain that, it just finishes.
No, I love that.
Kill the robot and it just ends. And then once again there is a dreadful sequel in which they're building robot duplicates for the world leaders, and it's oh god no, do not ruin it, and they ruin it. So sorry, a pet rant.
we've all got one tonight, apparently.
One.
Yeah.
I have one an episode.
Just going back to our what we could mix in. So some of Ursula K. Le Guin's anti-colonial works might fit the genre from the not glorifying the frontier perspective. Word for world is forest, perhaps.
I have that upstairs. I literally just bought it last week, but I haven't read it yet. So
a timely comment then.
Very timely.
Okay, I've decided that we, James, someone has asked this question, and I feel like we should just ask you this about the topic every time you're on. So, James, are there any good space Western board games that you would recommend?
Come back to me on that.
James has written a book about what is it called, James? Go on.
It's called Everybody Wins. 4 decades of the greatest board games ever made, about the rise of modern board games over the last 4 decades. Can't think of any off the top of my head. That doesn't mean they don't exist. There are some great Western board games. Colt Express, in which you are all bandits who are separately, simultaneously robbing the same train, is complete. Which, it's one of those. It's like Westworld. The moment you look at it, the premise falls apart. But it's great to play.
And it has a stagecoach expansion that you could run along the edge, which is.
It also has
brilliant.
a DeLorean expansion.
Yeah. Oh yes, it
my
does.
God.
Yeah, it does. I'd forgotten
why
about
not?
that. Well, that makes it count as sci-fi Western then.
Yes, it does.
Of course.
Yeah,
yes,
absolutely.
perfect. Okay,
Perfect.
question answered. Next.
And terraforming Mars, I would argue, is quite a frontier sort of.
Yes, though colonialist, I think, rather
exactly.
than frontier spirit.
And to prefigure the other question that you popped up there, there is quite a good Firefly board game as well. It takes a very long time to play. It takes over your entire table, but it is good. It's very true to the spirit of the show.
And Galaxy Trucker is clearly in the Western.
Oh my god! Yeah. Sorry, that just reminded me of that film Space Truckers. I only watched it because it had Dennis Hopper in, and I'll watch basically anything if Dennis Hopper's in it. And it is appalling. Oh, and Charles Dance is in it, and it's so bad. It's so bad. Don't watch it.
We have to.
Space Truckers. Don't do it. Don't put yourself through it.
So talking of Firefly, Master of Sussex asks, Firefly specifically used the post-Civil War setting as an influence, setting aside the problematic aspects of that, presumably in a real-world context. Are there specific contextual details you've used?
Contextual, I mean, in terms of historical or like just stuff from the real world?
Yeah,
I didn't pen the question, unfortunately. Okay. I cannot speak on the question penner's behalf.
I guess so. Like in the same way that like in Firefly, like it was like it was from the perspective of the South after they'd lost. So it was specifically taking that idea of how do you, if you fought for something you believed in, and now you're having to assimilate with something else, and then how do you cope with that? So I suppose just taking that like a specific example of aspects of frontier life or kind of what life was like in the West, and how that then would apply in a space context.
Well, I mean, every time I was thinking about this the other day, and I was like, it's a lot of people who've kind of been abandoned by their government, who are incredibly laissez-faire and just leave them at the end of a broken system where nothing really works and everything's fallen apart. So it's not political at all.
Yeah.
no, like kind of similarities with the current political climate. But
I had a
I-
dream. I had a dream about Boris Johnson last night, and he was very contrite about Brexit. And then I woke up and I was really disappointed. Sorry, that's just talking of the current political situation in the UK and how rampant inflation.
I think it's more. I think with the kind of world building, from a practical level, I sort of tried to think about what wouldn't be there in this place as opposed to what would be. You know, if you have got somewhere that people have sort of ostensibly settled and then gone, they kind of only want to hold on to it because it's territory and they don't care about it beyond it being useful in that sense. So I tried to sort of think about lives of people and what they'd use and how resourceful they'd have to be. And I didn't want it to be like you know, misery porn or anything. I didn't want it to be like glorifying it, because I kind of wanted to show people making lives for themselves and being resourceful, and the fact that community community positivity or like community action is you know, quite a sort of radical act. It's a radically hopeful act sometimes, and whether or not that comes across in the book. But I mean, some of my favorite characters are kind of like gangs basically who are trying to do the best they can in this broken environment that they've been put in. So less sort of historical, more contemporary, I suppose.
Actually, made me think like a sci-fi twist on the kind of gangs of New York situation, where you had like a place that had been frontier and had been very wild, and then had the veneer of respectability, but people were still reckoning with the moral complications of their youth. That could be quite a fertile ground to explore.
Gangs of New York.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That sounds like a Doctor Who episode.
It does.
Yes.
That's literally what they
100%.
call it. Yeah.
Yeah,
someone
call it that.
Yeah, someone had some cheap Victorian costumes going, so
Yeah.
check them over.
But we'll paint a couple of people blue and it'll be fine. Yeah.
Yeah.
You can just put like a laser gun on that guy.
Yeah, gangs of Hive City. So just on sort of Hive cities, when I was looking at the Wikipedia page, it also referenced like 40k as a space western setting, and I was like, really? Can we really say 40k is a space western setting? For one thing, there was no Nazis in the American West.
Well, yeah. I mean,
Well, there were Confederates. There were still Confederates,
Yeah.
which
True.
fill the same kind of role.
Yeah.
a definite ideological overlap. The Venn diagram.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you go right back to first edition and Rogue Trader, like a little bit, I guess.
Yeah.
And Necromunda again, like
I think they were thinking of like Cal Jericho, which is what made me think of that. So the comment of Gangs of Hive City made me think of Necromunda and Cal Jericho and all of those kind of lone heroes.
But as is often the case with GW stuff, like it's multiple influences like poured into the pot, and it's almost it's like it's Western, but Western by way of Mad Max. You know, it's that kind of. Yeah.
Kind of you've got the post-apocalyptic trappings. Kind of a lot of it's fallen away, and then you've got like a bit that goes along.
Yeah. Just as a footnote, today is the 40th anniversary of the publication of Warhammer. So you know, it's just worth noting that, I think, whether you love Warhammer, whether you regard it as a positive or negative influence on the world of games, there's no doubting that it's important. And
Which Warhammer? Which Warhammer?
The original.
The original.
White box,
All
first
Warhammer.
edition fantasy. Yeah.
There you go.
I have to admit, I've never played Warhammer, but I know. I used to help my cousin build all of his stuff and do painting, and help build sets, but I've never actually played it.
That's
Well,
allowed.
next Chimera, we'll just have to get some games in when you come up as well. Then.
Yeah. Oh, definitely.
Gorka Morka could have a Western angle if you played it right.
I think, the orcs in Warhammer do have that kind of Western gang element to it. They're completely lawless. They do what they want. You know,
They have that innate sense of
they're
manifest
uneducated.
I know though a Western I've watched from end to end. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid.
That's a good
That's
one.
a
That's good one to
Western.
watch.
A solid,
That's-
solid
yeah.
entry to the
Solid
genre.
Western. But the only weird thing about that is, like, raindrops keep falling on my head. That is a really weird interlude in that film, right?
Yeah.
What the
That
hell?
clearly, I'm sure that's a scene that was put in order to sell the song. Like it feels like it's not serving the narrative of the film. I don't think.
Well, also it undermines the relationship between Butch and the Sundance Kid. Like,
It's everyone's like, let's just close our eyes for a minute and let that go, and now let's
Yeah.
carry on.
Yeah.
Now that we've done that.
exactly.
Going
sorry.
back to Warhammer, there are nuns as well.
True.
They
True.
show up
There are.
sometimes.
I was about
Yeah.
to say, the Sisters of Mercy. No, wait, that's something different.
Yeah. I was going to call them that as well.
I'm sure Andrew
Yeah, where are
Eldritch
you?
is a
Good.
Warhammer character somewhere. He's
Yeah.
been written into the
Yeah,
background.
probably.
Yeah.
Yeah. So finally, we talked a little bit about Star Wars. Although I'm conscious, Stark, you didn't really. It wasn't one of your early touch points in the same way that it was. But can we talk about it just for a minute? So, do you think it's gone beyond its roots? So Star Wars is a space western. It's a fantasy. It's a samurai film mashup. So, is it still genre blending, or has it just become its own genre? Is it just its own thing now?
Oh no, I think it is still very much playing on the tropes of the genres that it's influenced by. You know, you saw this with Mandalorian. It's like very clear like touch points in certain genre and specifically like cinema as well. So it's what's the film where he's got the kid Zatoichi?
Yeah.
Where he's
Lone Wolf and Cub.
Lone Wolf and Cub, yeah. So very much drawing on the sort of samurai tradition. And I think it's interesting to sort of see it in dialogue with those things. And it is a dialogue, you know. But when you go then back, it's like with Kurosawa, you go back and watch Hidden Fortress and you compare it to Star Wars and you're just like, oh my God, this is so, but it becomes fascinating, like to see the influences, where it came from, and then kind of track back as well as track forward. And you know, same with the Magnificent Seven Samurai.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Even
And
Laurie and I.
Battle Beyond the Stars as well,
Yeah.
which is Seven Samurai in space, and very bad.
Yeah.
Mark McGranican, just going back to nuns, says the Nuns of Gavarone for nun-based puns is one of the Caiaphas Cain novels, if I recall correctly.
Oh, brilliant! That's Alex Stewart. I can't remember the name he writes under, but yes, that's
yeah. That's a good pun.
Yeah.
But yeah, they definitely, like, watching the behind the scenes stuff in The Mandalorian, like Favreau particularly talks about how they tried deliberately to not be influenced by Star Wars, but be influenced by what influenced Star Wars. So they deliberately went back to George's source material and looked at those, so that I guess to stop it becoming too bland or too derivative, but derivative in a different way, I guess.
Well, you risk kind of like self-cannibalizing and stuff. It like kind of becomes so self-recursive that you need fresh influence to kind of to keep it going. And I think maybe you saw this with Andor as well. Like needs like an injection of something other.
And Andor feels like it was going back to like like war films, kind of more of the I don't know.
Yeah.
You know, like
Rogue One
spy
was there
films.
as well.
Yeah.
It took a long time for Star Wars to get away from being space fantasy, from being myths and folklore in space, basically getting away from that structure and those tropes. And I'd say the 9 movies, the 3 trilogies, are very much still in that mold.
Yeah.
Though I don't know if I've said this here before, but I have said it before. I believe fervently that there is one Star Wars movie. It is called Star Wars, and everything else is fan fiction. And I want that tattooed on my gravestone. Which, given the reaction I've had to this statement a couple of times, may be due in the next week or so.
You mean like the first film is
the first film? It is called Star Wars. It stands alone. Everything else is made up subsequently.
I mean, I'm not averse to that opinion. Like, but then I'm not a huge like Star Wars fans, because it wasn't there when I was growing up in the same way as it was for other people. But I have a similar, very controversial opinion about Alien 3. So, you know, let's get them all out.
Go. Yeah. Because Alien 3 is
I'll draw a target on my back.
Yeah, and I have
Alien.
if you've got time, because we are almost at the end of our hour, but if you have time, tell us about Alien 3.
I will summarize it very quickly. No, it's just I watched the Alien films out of order. So I watched the first one, then I watched the third one, and then I watched the second one. And so I
Ooh.
thought the third one was really interesting. And I love the setting. Like, prison planet, brilliant setting. And I mean, I quite like quite bleak things sometimes. So it was really bleak, and I was like, I'm here for this. And then Charles Dance is there drinking his tea out of a tiny little cafetiere. And you're like, this is what's going on. This is great. And then but because I watched it, I think before the second one, I had a very different relationship to it. I mean, it goes completely off the rails at the end, which whatever. But I think as a setting, and I think for me, it feels much closer in character to the first one.
I have an embarrassing admission about. I don't know if I should say this online, but so in Alien 3, like, I don't know if you know, like, the original draft of the script, it was on like a wooded planet, like a forest planet.
Yeah.
Except when I read that, I didn't read it as like a wooded planet. I read it as
a wooden
planet, and I genuinely thought it was like a space station made out of wood. But I was like a grown ass adult when I read that, and I just thought, that would have been interesting. And it wasn't until I was in conversation with a friend that they pointed out how stupid I was being, and then I realized what it actually was.
Wooded.
That's my ritual humiliation of the week.
Yeah. And mine is, of course, my controversial take is, of course, that Twilight is not about vampires, it's about teenagers in love, but we've discussed that before. Full stop.
I'd agree with that.
Yeah, 100%. So that brings us to the end of a very enjoyable hour. Thank you so much for coming on again, Stark, and having a good old chat with us about everything space and everything Western.
Oh, it was my pleasure. It was really fun. I could probably just gone on and on.
I think we could have done. Yeah. So, thank you, as always, to my fellow Rookery panelists. Thank you to everyone in the chat, and of course to all of our patrons who support us. Like, subscribe, share, click the things, dingle the bell, and of course join us again next week for another Inside the Rookery. Until then, good night and caw-caw, caw-caw.